Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that knows what's happened to Kate Middleton. We're just not telling. How are you, Rob?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I've just been casually photoshopping my personal photographs and releasing them to the press.
Yes, as I often do that as well. I haven't
as a
quite
keen
got the
amateur
hands right.
photographer, yeah.
That's the only mention we're going to do of it this entire episode. I hope you know this, that we're not going on a deep dive down that rabbit hole. TikTok has you covered on that front, I think, and everywhere else. But fascinating.
I just before we move on from that, I think my favourite thing was the waking up in a Discord server full of English people, with like the one American who lives here being like, "Oh, so overnight everyone decided King Charles was dead in America." And we're like, why aren't the Brits telling us that this isn't true? And it's like, we were all asleep, guys. It was the middle of the night. Twitter having a completely normal one on that. But yes, let's move on. So doing our kind of semi-usual thing where we're like, oh, we could do headlines, but actually let's make a main story that knits together several stories. Have the Tories lost the plot? Or will the plotters take top spot? Rob, you could write headlines. But
Thank you.
It's a general Tory deep dive, I guess. We've got several stories that have come out. And as this episode has been a bit later than we'd intended, more and more of this has happened. I feel like news keeps happening, as you might expect in the run-up to a general election that hasn't been announced yet. What do we want to start with? The budget, perhaps? Spring budget? That's normally big news.
It is, and it normally is big news. And sometimes we would do an entire episode on the budget, right? But I think this time round, it's a bit of a damp squib as budgets go. One of the things that the incumbent has an advantage over, particularly when its rumblings of elections are happening in the background, is that you will usually have sort of an election budget, which is something that's meant to warm the public to you. You're meant to throw out a couple of coppers here and there and say, look, we still do care as you. The horrible austerity budget that we did when we came in, we're scrapping that. This one is jam for all. However,
I do love jam.
Yeah, exactly. But I
would say voters often note they love jam. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. But I would say that this budget didn't strike that chord. And really, I mean, I know we've had a few people saying that we're probably not going to get a May general election now or anytime soon, and Rishi Sunak has been very cagey on that matter. We'll go into more detail on that later. But this budget definitely was not one that seemed to have the public excited, or in fact those members of his own party. So I'm not going to do like a big deep dive into it, but I thought it might just be worth just looking over the taxation points, just because we've talked about it before and with previous budgets. One of the things that's undermined this Conservative administration amongst Conservative voters in particular is that this has been one of the highest taxation governments in history. I think the highest proportion of tax since World War II was something that the Telegraph ran on the front pages. The Conservatives like to market themselves as the party of low tax, so the fact that they had to keep putting them up or find other ways of getting revenue in was a bit of a stain on their reputation. And it's something that lots of leaders have tried to reduce, Liz Truss being one of them, who was unable to succeed. And now Rishi Sunak is facing calls from his own party to reduce taxation itself. So I don't know if you've got the link there, Tom, but if you just take
I have, yeah, I've had a quick look, yeah. 4 points there, and then a link to a calculator, as the BBC likes to do, show you how it affects you. So national insurance, which happens at your employer for most people, on PAYE, which is most employees in the UK. Apologies to our American listeners, we don't have to file our own taxes. It's generally done for us. Cut by 2p in the pound, which is always nice, which means you're saving money. We'll get to what national insurance does in a minute, I'm sure. But like, hey, I'm being taxed less. That's good, right? I have more money at the end of the month. Salary thresholds at which people start paying income tax and national insurance remain frozen. That's actually a bad thing, which we'll also get to in a moment, because there's this thing called fiscal drag that everyone's been talking about recently. Non-dom tax regime for UK residents whose permanent home is overseas to be replaced with new rules from April 2025. That's one of those great promises you make as a government when you know that a general election must be called before April 2025. Mm-hmm. But one reason this is kind of making headlines a bit more is this was kind of a Labour had talked around doing this. I don't know exactly what their policy was, but so basically they've said, hey Labour, that thing you said you were going to do, we're counting it as ours, but also you're going to have to implement it. And then finally, £5,000 UK ISA tax allowance for savers investing in UK focused, you can hear the air quotes, shares to be set up following a consultation. I'm not really sure on that one myself, because I thought a standard ISA tax-free allowance was way more than £5,000. So maybe it's an extra £5,000. You can tell me in a minute. So yeah, those are our 4 points. Other than maybe stealing Labour's thunder on one thing a bit, it doesn't sound particularly interesting, and that fiscal drag sounds like a bad thing.
Yeah, it is. It's very much so. This sort of like, it's a bit of sleight of hand by the Chancellor, I feel. You need something to grab headlines, and you want to reduce tax so that national insurance cut by 2p in the pound for employees and the self-employed. That's what they wanted as their big headline. We, the Conservatives, are again cutting tax. However, that second one, where they say we're actually freezing everything and making sure that the thresholds where people pay will remain the same, that means that the government can continue to rake in about the same amount of money in tax as they did before. Labour would call it something like a stealth tax, or something that doesn't necessarily grab the headlines, but the government can still balance the books. And at the end of the day, I think that 2p in the pound, although that sounds impressive to some people, I don't know how to your average voter it plays out. 2p in a pound, it's nice, but what does that say? How much does that save me over a year? I know the Conservatives can't give you a figure because everybody has different salaries, but they might be able to say, on average, it saves the UK taxpayer X amount of pounds a year. I think if they ran with that, it would be a bit more popular.
Say on the national insurance thing, I went on the BBC calculator, I put in 35k, which is the number they suggest. I think that's meant to be an average worker's salary. Obviously, some people will be lower, some people will be higher. And you're not being taxed on your tax-free allowance under 12.5k. Basically it would be about £900 more a year if you if you earn 35k or more. Obviously, if it's more, you're saving more. It's a percentage. That's about £75 a month, which, that's a small-sized shop or something. Like, it is helpful to people in the short term.
It's helpful. It's not nothing. I think Labour's points against it, people would say that, look, you have a cost of living crisis. You have inflation. Inflation has gone down at the moment. It was down from where it was. But I think that still, like the consumer price index and things like that, suggesting that those costs, it hasn't quite come back to the consumer yet. That reduction in inflation, on average, people's shops are still costing them more than they did a few years ago. Stuff like that. So, yeah, if you wanted to say this was a budget that really reduces the pressure on your, home saving, the pressure on your pocket, I don't think that's got through to the electorate. As I said, the tax cut is there, but I don't think that's a meteor enough tax cut for the Conservatives to really get behind. It didn't seem to rally much support for Rishi Sunak in the days following it. The non-dom tax regime is something that Rishi Sunak was not only stole from Labour, but something that he was under personal political pressure about, because there was a little controversy about his wife, who had non-dom tax status, and she was taking advantage of that scheme. And as the Labour Party and many people will point out, Rishi Sunak isn't the poorest Prime Minister we've ever had. He's actually quite well off. So to know that his own partner was maybe taking advantage of a tax cut that working people could not access, that seemed incredibly unfair. So I think him trying to underline that and move on from that is a savvy political move on his part, although Labour can just also turn around and say, look, you've stolen our idea, and that's happening when? April 2025? That's after the next general election. With the way the polls are going at the moment, Labour will just say, okay, yeah, we'll carry on doing that one as well. Shrug your shoulders. So, yeah, all in all, I think it was as I set up at the start, a fairly underwhelming budget that didn't do much either to convince the general public or Rishi Sunak's own party that this is a budget that you can go to an election on, right? Because I don't know what points on the doorstep. That's, you talk about that in general terms, politicians do, but what are you going to say on the doorstep to a voter to say, look, here's our manifesto, here's what we're doing for you, I just don't think those points are really going to make the headway that they need, right?
Yeah, it was interesting, I think, because kind of the news around it was like, oh, they've stolen this policy from Labour, and there's some other policies in there that are kind of interesting, but it doesn't really feel like a general election winner. And it feels like Rishi Sunak, and maybe we'll touch on this later, I'm not sure, is kind of holding on to this idea that the economy is about to turn a corner. And there's been some talk of that this week. He's like, look, the interest rate's coming down and things like this, although the Bank of England interest rate hasn't moved today, as far as I know.
It has not. No.
Yeah, okay.
The news today was it was frozen at 5.4%, I believe.
Yeah. So, interest rates still high. People can't buy houses. People struggling with day-to-day expenses. Everyone's feeling the pinch. And it's very much, this has been going on long enough that it's like, obviously, it's awful when anyone feels the pinch. But one of the points they've made in several political podcasts I listen to is that not only is it hitting people who are on lower incomes, which you would expect whenever there's some kind of crisis, but it's also affecting large swathes of the kind of the middle classes who would normally vote Tory. So like the people who are feeling it it's not just the people who would always vote Labour, it's also the people who would vote Tory. And this isn't helping that much. Sure, £75 a month is nothing to be sniffed at, but it's also not enough when you've been like, well, for the last 2 years, everything has been more expensive. Rents have gone up 9%. I just got an email from Virgin Media saying, oh, well, we're putting up your internet bill by 8.8%, which is not, like if everything's going up by that percent, because like all of these things where in order to make profit when interest rates are low, they're like, oh, it's the interest rate plus 4%, which seems ridiculous, and everyone, there's a load of bills you all have to pay. And yeah, sure, I could turn off my internet. I then wouldn't have a job. So there are things like that where people have to pay for them. And they're all going up in price. Everything's going up in price. 75 quid feels like too little too late, I guess.
Yeah, it is. And if you consider the other thing he could have done with this budget is he could have tried to Liz Truss it, right? And by that, I mean that surprise mini budget that had quite an effect on the economy in the negative, as most people would say. He could have gone for a risky move like that, because what some in his party would say is they said that Liz Truss had the right idea, she just did it at the wrong time, right? Or had certain other policies that undermined it. I think one example that those sort of conservatives argue is that she tried to not only cut tax but also try and fund the gas, the energy bill that they had to make up for the big rise in gas prices. And those two things is what spooked the markets and caused that to crash. But now we don't have that energy crisis. You could go cut taxes, be brave, do it away. The problem is that Rishi Sunak has the same chancellor as Liz Truss did by the end of her term, Jeremy Hunt. And Jeremy Hunt seems to have his head screwed on about what you need to do to manage the economy. And it appears that the economy cannot take a huge tax cut at this moment. If you want to do that, you need to have the growth to supplement it on the other side. And growth has been relatively stagnant. I believe this budget predicted that there would be a growth of around about 0.8 to 1.9%, which is, if you've got that going on, you can't do a significant tax cut to even that out. So Rishi Sunak is, in a way, caught between a rock and a hard place. He wants to offer the Conservatives some red meat, and that comes in the form of tax cuts, but he is ultimately responsible for balancing the budget and making sure the country can function, because we saw what happened the last time somebody didn't care about that. They were ousted pretty quickly because the economy was going the wrong way. So, yeah, tricky one for Rishi, but yeah, to sum up again, as we've said, not an election budget, fairly underwhelming. And I think that if we want something a bit more spectacular, that's going to have to come later in the year. As Jeremy Hunt suggested in a select committee, he said you would have to do that around about October. So that's had the rumour mill sort of running about when the actual general election will happen this year. So that might be one to look out for or cover in the future.
Yeah, and I think, well, Rishi Sunak said latter half of the year for general election, and also has ruled out a May election because, well, to have it on May 2nd in line with the local elections, it would have had to have been called by now due to these 6 weeks for a general election. Again, the Tories have no reason to want to call one earlier than they can, really. There's been a bit of rumours about, is Rishi Sunak going to be asked to step down and blah, blah, blah. But like, they're too close really to a general election to change horses at this rate. and the latest they can have it is January next year. There has to be some kind of middle ground. I feel like no one really wants a January election or a December one. The Tories are already going to have turnout problems, and it'll be even less if it's in the middle of winter. I would suggest. So yeah, I mean late October, early November is I think where the money seems to be now. Could always surprise us if something else happens, but yeah, it does seem like that's the way it's going. So, talking about elections and those kind of things, one thing you need is people in your party, MPs that you want to vote for. And we talked about this a bit, kind of in that weird period where Boris Johnson was trying to get loads of stuff through before the 2019 general election, which, wow, 5 years ago. Doing this podcast a long time, haven't we?
Yeah.
But yeah, you go back to that time and things were hectic and ridiculous. And Boris was like, I need a mandate. And obviously went off and had the general election. It's like, look, everyone voted for me to get this Brexit thing going. But before then, we had all these weird things where like the Lib Dems were like, we're going to be the party that doesn't like Brexit and we'll get loads of votes. And there were people moving around and there was some kind of central group that was meant to be like separate from the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems poached some people. There's a whole load of silly stuff going on. And yeah, basically this is me setting the scene for a defection. Is it a big defection? I'm not so sure when you look at his history, but who has defected and where to?
So Lee Anderson, former Deputy Conservative Party chair, has now defected to Reform UK. Now, I've put this up here because he had a scandal just before the spring budget and was suspended from the party. So if you were unaware, Lee Anderson was talking on GB News about Sadiq Khan, and in a interview, he said about Sadiq Khan, I don't actually believe that Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is that they've got control of Khan and they've got control of London. He's actually given our capital city away to his mates. The implication there being that Sadiq Khan, because he is of some, because of his background, he is therefore more predetermined to favour Islamists. There's a little bit of controversy about protests over the war in Gaza, pro-Palestine protests, etc., etc. So these were quite inflammatory remarks, derogatory remarks that I think are abhorrent and have no place in modern society, really, because of the implication that he's suggesting there. Sadiq Khan came out the next day and said so, and as a result, Rishi Sunak suspended him from the Conservative Party, and there was a big back and forth about should he apologise, and Lee Anderson effectively refused to backtrack from those comments or apologise for them. And as a result of this, after the spring budget statement, after he had been in the wilderness for all of a couple of weeks, he decided to make the jump to Reform UK, which, for those of you who are outside the UK or might not know, they are effectively sort of like UKIP in another skin.
UKIP 2.0.
Yeah, led by Richard Tice, who was another former UKIP member. Nigel Farage is not an official leader, but he's certainly involved and has been for a while in that party. And they are the ones taking up that right-wing mantle, I'd say. So to have somebody who is relatively well known as Lee Anderson, like he's made himself well known for saying controversial comments. He was made Deputy Conservative Party chair to try and make sure you got that wing of the party on side. So to lose him to another political party is a suggestion that you are losing that wing of the Conservative Party as well. And that's a big concern for Rishi Sunak forward.
Yeah, and I think also worth noting, Lee Anderson was previously Labour, right, a while back?
He was a Labour councillor and then went to Conservative. He is he's kind of, if you want to take like almost like a stereotypical red wall Conservative, those that were convinced under Boris Johnson to join the Conservatives. He was like, I'm working class, I'm always going to vote for Labour. Wait a second, I think Labour are going a bit too city-based with Corbyn, etc. Boris Johnson is making more sense. I support Brexit. I'm going to jump over to the Conservatives. And now the Conservatives aren't even right-wing enough for him anymore. He's got to jump to that sort of like more UKIP-y Reform UK side of things.
I think, I don't know if I heard an interview with him or if it was with Richard Tice, but like the argument trying to be that, like, you know, he's always, you know, he is from his local constituency and he's always tried to support the common man, and his argument therefore is like, I was Labour, but Labour did whatever, and that annoyed me, and I've always trying to represent the people, which is a reasonable argument for someone to make. I feel it does kind of fall flat when you look at his opinions. I don't think he's necessarily representing everyone there particularly well, but I can see why he would make that argument to try and explain away the fact he's jumped ship a few times.
Yeah, it's an argument that quite a few people use. They're like, oh, I didn't change, the party's changed. Like, my views stayed solid, but the party's changed so much that I was forced to jump to political parties who, at my opinion now, are the policies of Labour when he was a Labour councillor back in 2016 or whatever, compared to the policies of Reform UK now. I'd say they were pretty far apart, Lee, but you do you on that part.
Strong Principal Skinner energy. No, it's the children who are wrong.
Correct. Yeah. So my main point when you're talking about Reform UK and the big problem that they are creating for the Conservatives, and this is a problem that they've had for a long time, and it's finally coming to fruition, I think, for the Conservatives, and will be one of the big reasons that I think they will probably lose the next general election. Is that, so you were talking about like when Lee Anderson moved over, I've talked about red wall seats, the impact of Brexit. Brexit was a problem, and membership of the EU was a problem for the Conservative Party for a long while, right? So if you look at the 2015 general election results, that's the one where UKIP got a significant portion of the general election votes, but didn't win a single seat in Parliament. They clearly saw the threat from the right of the party, and the Conservatives decided that they wanted to own this issue. That's why David Cameron allowed people to have a vote on Brexit. That's why it was part of his manifesto back then, because he wanted to try and quiet that wing, get them under control. He was hoping that the referendum would be won by Remain, and then that wing of the party would float away and the Conservatives could be the party of remaining in the EU. That didn't happen, right? And so you are left with a party where you've got Theresa May and Boris Johnson trying to, and particularly under Boris Johnson, trying to court that wing of people, right? Those people who voted UKIP in the past, come over to the Conservatives, we're your natural home. And Boris Johnson did that incredibly well in 2019. That's why he won those red wall seats. That's why he won seats that Conservatives didn't usually win previously. He was able to gather that feeling of, we've got to get Brexit done, get it over, right? Now we're 5 years on from that wing of the party still exists, but they're still angry and they still don't feel quite conservative. They particularly, if the hope of the Conservatives was trying to bring them inside this broad church, it hasn't worked, because if anything, that's the side of the party that's kicked off the most and has been the one trying to make the most, problems for them. They brought down Theresa May in the past. They are trying to, they put forward proposals like a controversial Rwanda bill that Rishi Sunak is struggling to get through Parliament. He's struggling to get public support through it, but they are sort of wedded to it and saying that they will, I won't be a Conservative if this doesn't go through. And ultimately, the radicalisation of that party has, even if you've only seen one MP jump over to that side now, a lot of those voters that voted for Brexit in 2016, that voted Conservative in 2019, they have not been converted into long-term Conservative voters as the party intended. If anything, they have just broken off into this separate group, Reform UK, and that is causing them problems. There was an interview on GB News where Richard Tice was talking with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg, firmly on the right of the Conservative Party. You would say he was one of the Brexiteers in chief. Richard Tice is practically laughing in his face, saying that, look, people aren't going to vote for your lot next time, Jacob, because you're too soft. The real voters, the people who really want Brexit and want that side of things, will vote for Reform UK. And so they've made a rod for their own back, and it's about to sort of decimate, not perhaps split the party, but cause themselves a big electoral headache, not only in the next election, but in elections to come, if they can't get people back to a more moderate Conservative party. That's my opinion anyway. I don't know if you want to bring up, we looked at the polls and you shared a poll about earlier with me about where Rishi Sunak is and the key figure he's dipped below, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because when we get to our poll of polls later that we normally touch on, that hasn't caught up yet, because that's like a I mean, there are many aggregators out there, but that one always has a bit of a delay on it as various things come through and to do with when polls are held. Some polls get like tweeted out and stuff, so that you can aggregate stuff earlier. Last time, I think Reform, I've got a screenshot of it. Reform was at 10%. Looks like Reform is now up to 15%, which is even higher than the one I sent through to you. But the key thing here is not only are the Conservatives dipping down again, further away from Labour. Labour aren't actually at their highs that they've been at. Labour are kind of static. Reform are coming up as the Conservatives dip. But that means the Conservative support is now below where they were with Liz Truss. The whole thing they brought Sunak in to fix.
Precisely. And if you have a look at that Election Maps UK poll tracker, the Liz Truss dip, as it was, the Conservatives go down, Labour shoots up, right? Which suggests there's clear voter movement from Conservatives being converted into Labour voters because of those actions. As Sunak creeps down, as you said, Labour is static, but Reform UK has steadily gone up and up and up to the point where they are polling above the Liberal Democrats now. And I think the very clear leach there is that they are leaching votes from Conservatives, not from Labour, right? So when we were talking about 2019 and why Boris Johnson did well, and we were talking about how, for years we were talking how Brexit has reformed politics and how it's taking votes away from all the parties, but Labour seems to be suffering the most. They seem to be coming for the Conservatives. That's a problem. Lee Anderson is the perfect example of somebody who was Labour, converted into a Conservative for a small time under Boris Johnson, and has now converted to Reform UK, where now that doesn't work for the Conservatives at all. If anything, it works against them and makes a Labour victory more likely. The Conservatives had a small boost because they were able to convert UKIP voters into Conservative voters. If they don't stick around and only move further to the right, that can only benefit Labour more if they're able to keep this lead. So that's why it's such a big issue for the Conservatives, and why, even if it's just one MP, at the moment, it represents, I think, a bigger crisis for the Conservatives moving forward.
It's just worth noting that, like, that percentage, we've been discussing this a bit, some friends of mine, I think maybe even had a chat with you about it. So because of how first past the post works, this is similar to kind of when UKIP went up previously, spooked the Conservatives, we ended up with Brexit. Like, it's a long set of dominoes from that point, but that's essentially what happened. Very short timeline there, summary. But, Reform at 15%, still probably going to be predicted at most one MP, because it's a kind of across constituencies. It's not enough to necessarily win. And in those places where the Tories lose out to Reform, what happens is the Labour candidate, who's only a few percent behind the Tory, ends up winning. So in general, this doesn't mean we're going to suddenly get a load of Reform MPs. This is where some people would say, first past the post is a good system because it prevents them getting in, but actually it means we're not being representative. See previous special episodes about how voting systems work. The point being, people may go, 15%, that's higher than Lib Dem. The Lib Dems are still going to get 30 odd MPs out of this. The Reform may not even get one because of where the vote lies. This is across the whole country, and it's actually on the local level where MPs are elected that you will have to look at things. And we'll get to that a bit with our election trackers later. So if Reform are coming up to 15% now, that sounds like it's a decent chunk of the electorate. One thing to bear in mind, and I know we do a lot of stuff with polls and trackers, the question they ask in the poll is, who would you vote for in a general election if there was one today? In the run-up to an actual general election, things do narrow. What could be interesting here is that voting for Reform is your protest vote if you're right-wing and would never vote Labour. So it could be that it doesn't narrow as much as you would normally expect. There is nearly always narrowing between the two main parties, because the idea is, but if you're like, well, the Tories are going to lose anyway, that's where you're going to see people going, well, I'll show my true belief, which is vote for, I've lived in a Conservative constituency before where it was they always win, they get 60% of the vote. So, it frees you up to vote for the person you would most like to support. You can vote for the Green candidate or something like that. Whereas if you're in a close constituency, you might have to be I have to vote Labour to ensure I don't get a Conservative in. And the opposite is true for the people who vote right wing. So, yeah, I just pointing that out there, because people may go, polls narrow before. I don't know if they'll narrow enough. And in this set of circumstances, people are less likely to vote for the Conservatives. They want to show that they're angry at the Conservatives on that side of the political spectrum. So yeah, that kind of puts us in a good position to lead on to our next point. I shared with our group of friends a tweet the other day. Breaking news, they're going to the 1922 committee. how is Rishi Sunak's leadership faring? Do we have another Conservative leader election in the offing before the general election? Is that where we are, or is it just more sedate?
Yeah, no, I do think it's a lot of hot air at the moment, but it is worrying whenever Sir Graham Brady knocks on your door and your Conservative leader. It does tend to show that there is a discontent within the party, and lots of leaders have been on the end of that, a lot more than you'd think in the previous couple of years that we've had him around. But Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have been on the end of Sir Graham Brady's sort of slight nudge to say, excuse me, I don't think things are going quite as well as you expected. It's interesting because there's been a lot of stories in the press as well about certain plotters against Sunak. We've talked before about how the Conservatives are a pragmatic party, and if they think things are going wrong, they will change their leader. Under Liz Truss, they were particularly ruthless, given how short her tenure was. So that's why some people are thinking that it isn't beyond the pale that Rishi Sunak may get replaced. Personally, I think that it is very unlikely to happen, mostly because who on earth would want to take over the Conservative Party now with less than a year to put your ideas into place, tied up so much in, like, you'd probably have to respect the recent budget that's gone ahead, so you're tied into that. The name being passed around was Penny Mordaunt because, well, I guess people remember her carrying that sword, and she didn't stand for leader, but she would have been the next one on the list of that sort of summer election we had where Liz Truss won, Rishi Sunak came second, Penny Mordaunt was third. So she has some backing within the party as well. Kemi Badenoch has also been bandied around as a possible future leader of the Conservative Party, but a lot think that she would rather take the reins after the next general election and be a leader of the opposition rather than have a short time as Prime Minister and then probably be forced to resign if the Conservatives lose the next general election. So, the question of can a new leader save the Conservative Party at this late stage? I don't think so. I think that's absolutely pie in the sky thinking, and that they would be mad to do so. But the very fact that it's being discussed shows what a dire situation they are in, and particularly Rishi Sunak is in at the moment. He's being undermined by his own MPs. It appears MPs have left the party. And the other thing that I may have touched on previous episodes, but what's got to be a worry, I think in the time that we had our last podcast, Theresa May has said that she won't be standing as an MP again, right? This time will be her last. There are an awful lot of Conservative MPs, long-serving Conservative MPs, who have said, I'm taking a step back. There will be a new candidate who will represent my constituency moving forward. That shows a huge shift of talent and might show that some people really don't think that they can have a say in the next election, or they are gearing themselves up for a long time in opposition. And if you've been in Parliament for 8-10 years before then, and you don't want to have the fight of at least 5 years on the opposition benches, maybe more, now's a good time to go down. The amount who don't seem up for the fight, who don't want to follow this leader into battle that be the next general election, has to be concerning for Rishi Sunak as well. So, yeah, more big problems. And I think the meeting with Sir Graham Brady is just the cherry on top of a very soggy-bottomed cake, I imagine. I don't know. I don't know if that's... Is it cake that gets a soggy bottom? I can't remember. But a bad cake is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, all sorts of things in baking get a soggy bottom. It's generally something's gone wrong, except for a pineapple upside down cake. So it has been, as you say, it's been interesting. It's I think since we last spoke, it's almost felt like there's been an MP every other week kind of saying, or maybe even more frequently than that, someone saying, oh, I won't stand. And some of them obviously don't have the import as ex-Prime Minister Theresa May, but yeah, that felt like a big deal. And I think it is weird because people were looking back on Theresa May's premiership and being like, oh, wasn't it so nice? And it was relatively calm when you compare. We had loads of weird things about votes for Brexit and stuff that didn't work out. But in general, like, people on the left were kind of like almost reminiscing, and people being like, whoa, you have to remember all these bad things she brought in when she was in the Home Office, and also, as Prime Minister, like stuff that came on in Under Her Watch, but at least, if the party you don't like is in power, they're going to do things you don't like. but it at least felt like things were relatively stable. Like she said, strong and stable, and we laughed at it at the time, but comparatively, I think, it feels like an end of an era with a lot of people we know on the Conservative side saying it's not worth me running, because they will know they either know they're going to lose, or they've got to that point where they're like, look, we've been in government for 14 years. A lot of people don't stay in a job for 14 years, if you've been there all the way through. So it can be a mix of things. But if you thought you were going to win and you definitely had a job to go forwards and you had things you wanted to do, you would stay around. So I think it's clear that, we've said they're on their way out for a while. I don't think that would be a surprise. The polls are telling us this. The people leaving are telling us this. The people defecting are telling us this. It's all there. Everything... Like, it is very much Labour's election to lose. And we've said that before, and it's only getting more and more true. So, I think people want a change. That happens. You get to that point where, like, we've had enough as collectively, and you get that feeling. And it's not just that, oh, my bubble doesn't, like, everyone is like, when the newspapers start to change, and you get the newspapers being like, I don't think there's many newspapers defending Rishi Sunak anymore out of the big newspapers. There might be one, possibly the Mail, I forget. But you look at the headlines, everyone's like, come on. So speaking of elections that it's Labour's to lose, when is it going to be? We mentioned some dates earlier. Do you have any better dates? I mean, obviously it can't now be in time for May.
No, it can't. And I think October is the prevailing wisdom now, given what Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said. I just wanted to put this sort of out there because one of the key sort of like criteria for Rishi Sunak, or one of the things that, Graham Brady or the plotters have said, it's like, okay, Rishi, we'll give you time, but you've got to make an impact at the May elections, right? We'll see how the voters are in May, and if you're doing even worse than like Theresa May did, or Liz Truss didn't have a chance to have a local election under her premiership, which is a very strange thing to happen for a prime minister. But if you don't have any boost, or if it goes incredibly wrong, then that's when we're really going to be sounding the alarm bells, because that's another sort of litmus test of where the public are with you. So the May elections are important. I've put a link down there to the amount of seats and everything that is available. So when these elections last happened, that was in 2021. So talking the back end of COVID-ish, but Boris Johnson was only 2 years into his premiership, so he wasn't at that disastrous sort of spiral that he got towards the end of it. So it was a relatively good night for Boris Johnson in 2021. So that makes things worse for Rishi Sunak, because it means he has the opportunity to lose even more seats. If they had a bad night in 2021, then like the floor is there to kind of save you. So there's an awful lot of things to look out on that night. I think the Conservatives will be in damage control mode and will probably have a limit of, we expected us to lose 500 seats. We're actually quite happy that we only lost 500 seats. Doing those sort of speeches. The other one that's happening on the same day is the London mayoral election between Sadiq Khan and Susan Hall. Now, Susan Hall hasn't impressed me from the little I've seen of her on LBC. She hasn't impressed me as a candidate. There's an awful lot of interviews that she's done where she's sort of embarrassed herself on that platform. A bizarre one about her having her wallet stolen and then she found it again. Maybe it didn't get stolen at all. Maybe she left it on the tube. Who knows? Her not knowing who owns a certain bridge in London to resolve a dispute. There've been quite a lot of faux pas from that campaign. So I think it's unlikely that the Conservatives will win in London. The thing that Sadiq Khan has to contend with now is he's been London mayor for quite a few terms now, and the ULEZ scheme was something that was so unpopular, or seems to have garnered a little bit of support amongst Conservatives at least, that was enough to win them Boris Johnson's old seat when that went to a by-election. So I think some of them might be trying to use this election as a bit of a referendum on that policy issue, or people can put it as a protest vote against Sadiq Khan just because he is the incumbent. He has that record to defend. So I don't think Labour are going to win that in like a landslide, as some might think they will. But I do think it should be a win for Sadiq on the night. Anyway, it's just interesting that we've got these elections right around the corner now. Another big test of Rishi Sunak's leadership. It does seem that every other week, every other month, he's kind of in damage control mode. He's just lurching from crisis to crisis, big event to big event. He seems to be defending his position all the time. That seems at real odds what his election strategy is at the moment, his big message that he has. And I don't know if you've seen him going up and down the country and trying to put forward this vision on morning TV, stuff like that. The message from the Conservatives now is stick with the plan. The plan is working. Okay, so things might look bad now, but we're turning the corner. Prosperity is just a few months away. Stick with me. Don't change horses now. Don't move to Labour because things were bad. We're helping get things better. And he's trying to do that sort of like inflation is coming down. That's because of me. Debatable, but that's what he's doing. Look, the economy is growing by 1.9%. That's great, isn't it? Think how much it could grow if we keep with this plan. Stick with me. The problem is I think that message, when you've had 14 years of Conservative government, even if you haven't had that much of Rishi Sunak government, is a very tough sell. It's all they've got at the moment. So he has to sort of believe that if he delivers results, the public may stand up and pay attention to that, and will switch to Conservatives. But he will require a really big result within the next 6 months if he wants to get any type of a sort of movement in those polls back towards the Conservatives.
I just wanted to touch on the London mayoral election you mentioned there, because someone said something ridiculous about Suzanne Hall the other day. I can't remember what they were like, saying, the Conservative Party, we've got these amazing candidates or something like that. And then it was immediately pointed out, I think, on newscast that she's 25% behind in the polls, behind Khan. So I've just shared the latest opinion polling there. And yeah, she was made when she announced herself, but I think, as you say, she keeps coming out saying poorly defending herself or talking about her policies everywhere, and she's dropped down quite a bit. And I'm sure there will be some ULEZ protest votes. Those, I feel, are mostly in one or two specific constituencies at the edge of London, and it's the whole of London that gets polled. Obviously, I no longer live in London, so I don't quite have my finger on the pulse, but, I go up there fairly often, and I would say in the kind of Surrey side of the ULEZ, people kind of accept it, and they're the kind of people who are generally more pro-green kind of ideas anyway. So I think there are some specific loud people who are against it, but they're the kind of people who'd be voting Conservative anyway. I don't think there's a lot of Labour voters who are going to choose to not vote for Khan in that situation because of the ULEZ. I think generally people kind of... And also ULEZ has had a time to bed down now. When it was first there, it was kind of... Most people aren't affected by ULEZ. The only vehicle I'm aware of that we had to be aware of with it was one of our really old minibuses, and I'm talking like a scouting minibus that's like 20 years old. And that's exactly what ULEZ is for. We're on the edge of London. It wasn't going in the ULEZ zone. It was fine. But, it's that kind of thing where I think as the very few people have had to change their car because of ULEZ, because nearly all cars are compliant unless they're very old, it's more the kind of truck drivers, lorry drivers who might have issues.
And I agree with you there. I think it's just an example of the one thing that Conservatives seemed to work in London. I mean, they won a constituency that was previously run by a Conservative and a fairly, who was the Prime Minister of the country. So that suggests that constituency was already okay. If they were okay with Boris Johnson, they're probably okay with other Conservatives. So, there were lots of factors in that local election, but it is the one thing that Conservatives cling to for London. I think it's their one big argument, because everything else Susan Hall is saying isn't impressive. Yes, should be a fairly significant win for Khan in London.
So speaking of elections, it's time to check our polls. So I have some bad news for you, Rob. Our general election predictor has not updated since we last spoke. So The one that we normally go to doesn't have those latest numbers in there. But just to remind you, it's predicting a Labour majority of 260, which is a lot. And with their predicted seats of 455, I think that was, as we discussed the other day, that predicted number of seats means and that majority would put them in a better place than the 1997 landslide Tony Blair, which we were saying was wild when we discussed it last time. And given the polling has gone even worse for the Conservatives in between, I'm sure when that updates at the end of the month, it will make for some interesting reading. It's also worth noting that there is no longer, in their probability of possible outcomes, any chance of a Conservative control. It's Labour majority, 95%, Labour minority, 4%, no overall control, 1%. So, yeah, it's not going to be the Conservatives based on that. Obviously, there's modelling there, but yeah, pretty damning for the Conservatives. Heading over to the poll of polls, we kind of touched on this. Poll of polls is a bit behind. March 11th is the last kind of summarised day. Labour on 43%, Conservatives on 24%, Reform on 12%, Lib Dems on 10%, Greens on 5%, etc. That is actually not doesn't paint the same picture as that other poll we've discussed, where you can see the Conservative shift to Reform. So I'm not sure there's much more we have to say on this because we've already touched on polling.
Yeah, the only thing that I might want to touch on is I was having a look at the tracker. You've got the time limit that you can do. So I went 3 years back just to have a look at what the state of play was during the last local elections. So they happened around May 2021. In May 2021, the polls read Conservatives 43, Labour 32, right? So Rishi Sunak has to go into a local election campaign where Labour have raised their profile by at least 10 to 12 percentage points, and the Conservatives have dropped not quite 20, but at least 15. So with that swing happening on a national scale and then putting it into a local, so that's the kind of challenge that he's focused. If you're talking about why people are looking at the next May elections and saying why it can be so significantly different for the Conservative this stage, that's why things have changed an awful lot in 3 years.
Saying that though, one point I've just posted, if you can click on that same chart, all, and it shows you all time, which is like got one weird data point in like 2010, which I guess must be the general election. And then when they started actually tracking stuff, is worth noting the last time. Now, Labour are obviously in a stronger position right now, but if you look back to before Boris Johnson like kind of started taking over, around the time Theresa May was there, Conservatives are down to 20%, which is even lower than now. Lib Dems are up to 18%, Reform at 22%, and Labour on 23%. Now, obviously, things are different. But what I'm saying is, like, we have seen Reform take from the Conservatives before, and when you get to a general election, as I said, things may narrow. I think people are probably a bit fed up with the Conservatives now, and so that won't happen. And they don't have Boris, who was a big draw for certain people. So I don't think it's going to be the same set of circumstances. But it is worth noting, polls have been closer. And then if you look a few months later, the 2019 general election, it was kind of quite a shock how far the Conservatives were ahead. It was a shock to us at the time, I feel, that Boris won with so many seats. So, yeah. We wait and see. But, yeah, hopefully a general election gets announced soon. Yeah, I don't think that I've got much else to say on that. I assume that was the last of your points.
It was, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you as always, Rob, for joining me. You can find us on all our usual places. You can find us at parliamentary.observer, a domain name I'm still not quite sure. I mean, I was allowed to have, but it's great. You can find us on X while it's still going, and you can find us on Instagram at unparlepodcast. You can find us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw $1 our way to get access to bonus content from all of our shows, although it's mostly unparliamentary language these days. You get Rob and I chatting about stuff. We chatted about things middle-aged people chat about. We're getting old. We talked about running. Maybe that's not what you want to hear, but yeah, I mean, those chats are wild and varied. It was just a bit more kind of life admin this time, but sometimes it's about video games or hobbies and other stuff, so definitely worth checking out. And of course, you can also find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language and Reddit as /r/unparliamentary. I guess there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye.
Bye, bye,
Bye.
bye, bye.